Rhyros, a once thriving planet, now teetered on the brink of extinction. Its sun, an unstable giant, had begun to devour the inner planets, including Rhyros itself. The planet's surface was a patchwork of desolation and dying ecosystems. For centuries, its people had enjoyed prosperity and peace, but as the sun grew unstable, so did the planet. The oceans boiled away, the forests withered, and the cities crumbled under the constant bombardment of solar radiation. In the capital city of Velen, hidden deep beneath the planet's surface in massive subterranean complexes, the last remnants of Rhyros' civilization lived. These survivors, known as the Tyler, were determined to escape the dying world they had once called home. There was no hope for the surface. Nothing could survive there. The Tyler had turned inward, creating a complex network of tunnels, labs, and workshops designed to preserve their culture and knowledge, but even this refuge was beginning to feel the effects of the planet's decay. At the heart of the Tyler's final refuge stood Dr. Saris Kalin, a brilliant but reclusive scientist who had dedicated her life to the survival of her people. She had devised a plan, a way to escape the dying planet by building a ship capable of reaching the stars. But there was a problem. The Tyler lacked the resources to build such a vessel. The materials they had were slowly being depleted, and time was running out. Dr. Kalin had one last idea. She had theorized that the ancient artifacts scattered across Rhyros held the key to the ship's construction. These artifacts, remnants of a long-forgotten civilization that had once dominated the galaxy, were rumored to contain technologies far beyond anything the Tyler had ever known. But locating and retrieving them would be a monumental task. The Tyler had little knowledge of the ancient ruins that dotted the surface, and their scouts had failed to find anything useful in years of searching. Saris stood in the darkened chamber of the lab, staring at the glowing map on the holographic screen before her. The ruins were spread out across the surface, like a puzzle she could not yet solve. If she could find the right one, the key to their salvation might finally be in reach. But she knew there was more at stake than just their survival. The galaxy had been silent for centuries, and many believed it was because the ancient race that had once ruled the stars had vanished into history. If they could rebuild, could they also revive the legacy of the stars? The first artifact was rumored to be buried beneath the ruins of a once proud city on the edge of the Great Desert. The problem, however, was that the desert was now a hostile place, a vast wasteland where radiation storms could tear through even the toughest of structures. And the journey to the site was perilous. Nothing had survived in that part of the world in generations. Saris knew she could not undertake the mission alone. The Tyler had no army, no fleet to send. But there was one man who had the skill, the courage, and the knowledge needed to navigate the unforgiving landscape of Rhyros. His name was Kale Darris, a former soldier turned scavenger, and he was the only one who had survived the trials of the desert and lived to tell the tale. Kale was a man of few words, preferring action over speech. His face was rugged, his eyes sharp with the kind of focus that had kept him alive for so many years. He had been part of a military expedition that had ventured into the desert years ago, seeking answers about the ancient civilization that had once ruled Rhyros. They never returned, but Kale had escaped with his life, and a wealth of knowledge that could prove invaluable to the Tyler. Dr. Kalin contacted Kale in the hopes that he would agree to assist her in retrieving the artifact. She didn't expect him to be easy to persuade. He was a man of honor, but his trust was hard to win. Kale had seen too much death and destruction, and he no longer believed in the ideals that had once driven him. But Saris made him an offer he couldn't refuse. His assistance would not only help them secure the future of Rhyros, but it would also restore the hope of an entire people who had long ago given up on the stars. As Kale agreed to join the mission, he looked out over the dying city of Velen, feeling a bitter weight in his heart. He had fought for Rhyros before, but now it felt different. This was not just about survival. This was about redemption. And perhaps, for the first time in years, Kale dared to believe that Rhyros had a future beyond the shadow of its dying sun. Together, Saris and Kale set out on a journey that would change not only their planet's fate, but the fate of the galaxy itself. But the road ahead was filled with dangers they could not yet imagine. An ancient power, long thought lost, had awakened, and it would stop at nothing to ensure that Rhyros remained buried beneath the ashes of its history. The sun of Rhyros had cast its final, dying light over the shattered world. From the depths of Velen, Saris Kalen and Kael Darris emerged into the remnants of what had once been a proud civilization. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath their feet, once fertile and teeming with life, was now little more than cracked stone and endless dust. The long journey ahead would take them through the treacherous expanse of the Great Desert, a place where even the bravest of souls had once dared not tread. The journey to the ruins of the ancient city began under the cover of the crumbling sky. Kael's expression was one of quiet determination as he led the way, his weathered boots crunching on the desert's cracked surface. Saris followed closely behind, her mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. She had spent years studying the ancient ruins of Rhyros, poring over forgotten texts and deciphering cryptic maps. But even with all her knowledge, nothing could prepare her for the desolate reality of the wasteland they were now crossing. The wind howled across the desert, carrying with it the faint echoes of a past civilization. Once, this place had been home to great cities, thriving trade routes, and bustling markets. Now, it was nothing but a graveyard of forgotten history. The radiation storms had long ago driven the last remnants of life into hiding, and what remained was little more than the ruins of a once great empire. Kael moved with an ease that came from years of survival in this hostile environment. He knew the desert better than anyone, and his instincts had kept him alive through countless storms and battles. He pointed to a distant ridge, where the ruins of the ancient city were said to lie buried beneath the sands. "There," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The artifact is beneath those ruins. But getting there won't be easy. The desert hides more than just dust. It's home to things that should never have survived." Saris nodded, her mind focused on the mission. She had no illusions about the dangers they would face, but her resolve was unshakable. The artifact they sought was their last hope, a key to unlocking the secrets of the ancient civilization that had once ruled the galaxy. If they could recover it, they might have the means to save Rhyros from its inevitable demise. As they made their way across the barren landscape, the temperature rose, and the air became thick with the oppressive heat. The sun, though dying, still managed to scorch the planet's surface, making each step feel like an eternity. Kael glanced over his shoulder at Saris, noting the sweat beading on her brow. Despite her brilliance, she was not made for the desert. But there was something about her, something that drove her forward, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "We'll need to move faster," Kael muttered, scanning the horizon. "The radiation storms are unpredictable. We don't have much time before they hit." Saris acknowledged his warning with a terse nod. She had studied the storms extensively, understanding the patterns, the way they moved across the landscape like living things. But even with her knowledge, there was no guarantee they could outrun the storms. The wind was picking up, and the sand began to swirl in the distance. It was coming. Kael increased their pace, leading them towards the ancient city. The sand shifted beneath their feet, and the sun seemed to grow even more oppressive, bearing down on them with a weight that threatened to crush their spirits. Saris could feel her energy waning, but she refused to stop. Rhyros was counting on them. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the air, followed by a flash of blinding light. The radiation storm had arrived. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the wind howled with a fury that threatened to tear them apart. Kael pushed forward, his face grim with determination. Saris struggled to keep up, the sand stinging her skin like shards of glass. She could barely see through the thick, choking dust, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. Kael grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a nearby rock outcropping that provided shelter from the storm. They huddled there, the howling winds pressing against their bodies as the storm raged around them. The air was thick with radiation, and Saris could feel the faintest twinge of nausea in the pit of her stomach. "We'll wait it out," Kael said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We can't risk getting caught out in the open." It's not just the storm we have to worry about. The creatures that roam the desert are drawn to the radiation. And they're not friendly. Saris didn't ask what he meant. She could hear the sounds of something moving in the distance, a low growl that sent a chill down her spine. She had studied the creatures that had adapted to the harsh desert environment, the massive, predatory beasts that roamed the wasteland, feeding on anything that crossed their path. But even with her knowledge, the reality of facing them was far more terrifying than she had imagined. As the storm raged on, Kale kept watch, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Saris sat in silence, her mind racing. She knew the stakes. They had to find the artifact before the last of Rairo's sun burned out. Time was running out, and they had no idea what dangers lay ahead in the ruins that awaited them. But in the depths of the storm, Saris felt a spark of something more, a flicker of hope that refused to die. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with everything she had. For Rairos, for the stars. The storm raged for hours, its fury relentless. Inside the shelter of the rock outcropping, Saris and Kale huddled in silence, waiting for the wind and radiation to subside. The dust storm whirled outside, blocking out the sun, turning the landscape into a sea of swirling sand and dark clouds. The air was thick, oppressive, and every breath they took felt like inhaling a toxic mixture of heat and poison. As the storm began to subside, Kale stood and scanned the horizon. The growling of distant creatures had quieted, and the eerie calm that followed the storm settled over the desert. Despite the dangers, they had to keep moving. Time was running out for Rairos, and they were close, closer than ever to the ancient ruins that might hold the key to their salvation. "We can make it," Kale muttered, his voice carrying the weight of years spent surviving the wasteland. His eyes gleamed with an intensity born from experience. He knew the desert better than anyone, and if anyone could lead them through the dangers of the ruins, it was him. Saris adjusted her equipment and stood, her resolve hardening with each passing minute. The radiation storm had tested her, but it had not broken her spirit. She was determined to uncover the secrets of the ancient civilization, to retrieve the artifact that could turn the tide for Rairos. She had no choice but to press on. The ancient city was within reach now, only a few miles ahead, hidden beneath a great mound of sand. Kale set the course, leading them toward the city's ruined outskirts. They moved cautiously, staying low to the ground, watching for any signs of danger. The desert creatures might have retreated during the storm, but they could return at any moment. As they drew closer, the first signs of the city began to emerge from beneath the shifting sands. Broken pillars, cracked stone walls, and crumbled archways protruded from the ground, remnants of a time long past. The architecture was unlike anything Saris had seen before, elegant yet strange, with patterns and shapes that seemed almost alien. The city, once a thriving metropolis, now lay in ruins. Its streets were empty, its buildings shattered. There was no sign of life, save for the faint traces of ancient machinery and the remnants of a civilization that had long since vanished. But among the ruins there was a feeling of something more, something powerful, and Saris felt it deep within her bones. "Here," Kale said, stopping in front of a large stone structure, its walls carved with intricate symbols. "This is where it lies. The artifact." Saris could feel the pulse of the ancient power in the air, almost like a whisper, urging her forward. She studied the carvings on the stone walls, her fingers tracing the faded symbols. Her mind raced as she tried to decipher the meaning behind the glyphs. These markings were unlike anything in Tyler's records. The technology of the ancient civilization was far more advanced than they had ever imagined. Kale stepped forward and placed his hand on a large, flat stone slab embedded in the center of the structure. With a low rumble, the slab began to shift, revealing a dark staircase leading downward. The air grew colder as they descended into the depths of the ruins, the faint glow of an ancient light source flickering in the distance. Saris's heart raced. This was it. The heart of the city. The place where the artifact awaited. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her as they ventured deeper into the forgotten catacombs of the ancient city. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a large chamber, its walls lined with more cryptic symbols. The space was vast and cavernous, with towering columns that stretched into the darkness above. In the center of the room, a pedestal stood, bathed in an eerie, pulsating light. On the pedestal rested the artifact. It was a small, crystalline object, glowing with an otherworldly blue light. The shape was angular, almost geometric, and its surface shimmered with strange patterns that seemed to shift and change as Ceres gazed at it. This was the key they had been searching for, the thing that could save Rairos or destroy it. Ceres stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the artifact. But just as her fingers brushed against the crystal, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and guttural, vibrating through the stone walls. "You should not have come." The voice was disembodied, reverberating from every corner of the room. It sent a chill down Ceres's spine, and she instinctively stepped back. Kale's hand went to the blaster at his side, his gaze scanning the darkness. From the shadows of the chamber, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in black, with a presence that seemed to distort the very air around it. Its face was hidden beneath the hood of its cloak, but Ceres could feel its eyes on her, watching, judging. The figure stepped forward, its movements fluid, almost unnatural. "You seek to awaken the power of the Ancient Ones," the figure said, its voice dripping with disdain. "But you do not understand the consequences." Ceres stood frozen, her mind racing. The figure's words held weight. There was something deeply dangerous about the artifact. She had known it might be a weapon, but she had never imagined it could be this dangerous. The ancient civilization that had created it, had they fallen because of their own arrogance? Kale's hand tightened around his blaster, but he didn't draw it. He had seen too many enemies in the desert to make rash decisions. "Who are you?" Ceres asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised its hand, and the chamber seemed to warp, the walls flickering with strange energy. The air hummed with power. "I am the guardian of this place," the figure said, "and I will ensure that the power of the ancients remains sealed. For you, for Rairos, and for the galaxy, it must stay forgotten." Ceres felt a surge of fear, but she also felt something else, a flicker of defiance. She had come too far to turn back now. This was the moment that could change everything. She couldn't allow fear to stop her from saving her people. With a quick glance at Kale, Ceres made her choice. "Then we'll make sure the galaxy remembers," she said, her voice unwavering. And with that, the battle for the artifact began. The chamber seemed to pulse with an eerie energy as the Guardian's words hung in the air. Ceres stood tall, facing the cloaked figure with a defiant gaze, her hand still inches from the glowing artifact on the pedestal. The figure's presence seemed to twist the very fabric of reality, making the air thick with an almost palpable tension. "You don't understand," the Guardian intoned again, its voice shifting, becoming more insistent. "The power you seek is not something you can control. It is a force that devours worlds, a force that broke our civilization. It will break you too." Kale stepped forward, his body tense, ready for whatever might come. He had seen many threats in his years of survival, but this was different. This was no ordinary foe, no creature of the desert or scavenger out for revenge. This being radiated ancient power, something far beyond their comprehension. He placed his hand on Ceres's arm, his grip firm but reassuring. "We'll handle this, together," he said, his voice low and steady. But before Ceres could reply, the Guardian raised its hand, and the chamber around them shuddered. The columns groaned, their ancient stone creaking as though alive, as a surge of energy crackled through the air. Ceres felt the weight of the power pressing against her chest, almost suffocating in its intensity. In a blur of motion, the figure lunged forward, its cloak trailing behind it like a shadow. Its speed was unnatural, and it moved with a precision that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Before Ceres or Kale could react, the Guardian's hand shot out, striking the ground between them with a force that sent a shockwave through the chamber. The stone floor cracked, splitting apart with a deafening sound, and the very walls seemed to bend under the pressure. Kale's reflexes kicked in, and he grabbed Saris, pulling her to the side just as the ground beneath them split open. The Guardian's eyes, glowing faintly with a piercing blue light, locked onto them, and a surge of energy blasted from its outstretched hand, slamming into the pillars with such force that they crumbled to dust. Saris stumbled, her heart racing as she tried to steady herself. The chamber was disintegrating around them, debris falling from the crumbling ceiling. She could feel the heat of the energy as it scorched the air, burning everything in its path. "Get to the artifact," Kale shouted over the chaos, his voice urgent. He was already on his feet, scanning the area for an escape route, but there was nowhere to hide from the Guardian's fury. Saris hesitated. She had known from the start that this mission was dangerous, that the ancient power was not something to be trifled with. But seeing the destruction unfold before her, she realized just how truly deadly this force was. The Guardian was more than a mere protector. It was a weapon itself, a living embodiment of the destructive power that had once shattered its civilization. But she couldn't back down now. She turned to Kale. "Cover me," she ordered, her voice fierce despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Kale didn't hesitate. He pulled his blaster from its holster and fired, sending blasts of energy toward the Guardian. Each shot landed with a crack, but the figure barely flinched. The energy seemed to dissipate before it could reach its target, absorbed by an invisible barrier that shimmered around the Guardian like a shield. The Guardian's eyes flared with light as it raised its hand again, summoning another wave of destructive energy. Saris knew they couldn't keep this up for long. They were outmatched, outgunned, and surrounded by collapsing stone and swirling energy. She glanced back at the artifact. It seemed to glow even brighter now, pulsing with a strange energy that resonated in her very bones. Whatever the artifact was, it was connected to this force, this Guardian, and to the power that had once ruled the galaxy. If they could unlock it, if they could control it, perhaps they could turn the tide. But would they be able to survive the attempt? With her heart pounding in her chest, Saris bolted toward the pedestal, her legs pumping as the ground continued to tremble beneath her. Kale's shots echoed in the air, but the Guardian barely seemed to notice. It was focused on her now, its form blurring as it phased through the air with impossible speed. As Saris reached the pedestal, she hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the artifact. She had spent her life studying ancient texts and deciphering cryptic codes, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer power radiating from the artifact. She could feel its pull, like a magnetic force drawing her in, whispering to her mind in ways she couldn't comprehend. The Guardian's figure loomed behind her, its shadow stretching across the room. "Do not touch it," it warned, its voice thick with rage. But Saris had no choice. This was their last chance. With a deep breath, she grasped the artifact, her fingers wrapping around the cool, crystalline surface. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through her body, blasting through her veins like liquid fire. She gasped, stumbling back as the world seemed to explode around her. The chamber, the ruins, the very fabric of reality itself seemed to warp and twist. The power of the artifact flooded her senses, and for an instant, she felt a connection to the ancient civilization, its rise, its glory, and its tragic fall. She saw visions of stars being born and worlds being destroyed, of ships traveling across the galaxy at unimaginable speeds, and of civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. She could feel the weight of their knowledge, their wisdom, and their hubris. The Guardian let out a deafening roar, but Saris barely registered it. The power was overwhelming, and she felt herself being pulled into its core. Her vision blurred, her body trembling under the strain of the energy coursing through her. The Guardian surged forward, its hand outstretched to strike her down, but Kale moved faster, positioning himself between them. He fired again, his shots landing in quick succession, but this time they seemed to have an effect. The Guardian staggered back, the shield flickering for just a moment. That was all Kale needed. With a final, defiant yell, He charged at the Guardian, his blaster blazing. The two figures collided in a burst of light and force, but it was the artifact that held the real power. As Kale fought with the Guardian, Ceres focused on the artifact, her mind sharpening as the energy coursed through her. She didn't understand it fully, not yet, but she could feel the answer coming. The artifact wasn't just a weapon.
It was a key.
A key to something far greater, something beyond the confines of Rairos and its dying sun. And as the light from the artifact flared brighter, Ceres knew that their fight was only beginning. The galaxy had no idea what was about to be unleashed. The explosion of light from the artifact bathed the chamber in an otherworldly glow, blinding Ceres for a moment. Her body felt weightless, as though she were suspended in the very fabric of the universe. The power flowing through her was overwhelming, alien, ancient, yet undeniably familiar. She felt connected to something beyond herself, as though she had unlocked a door to a forgotten age, and the knowledge and energy of that age now coursed through her. The Guardian recoiled, its form flickering as the artifact's energy clashed with its own. It seemed almost as if the Guardian, too, were being affected by the raw power emanating from the artifact. The air vibrated with an intensity that shook the very foundations of the chamber. Ceres could see the Guardian's form warping, its cloak unraveling in waves of dark energy. Kale had fought off the immediate effects of the artifact's explosion, but the conflict was far from over. He fired another shot at the Guardian, but this time, the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised both hands in a fluid motion, and the room seemed to fold in on itself as a new surge of power erupted from the Guardian. Dark tendrils of energy shot toward Kale, wrapping around him like chains, pulling him toward the Guardian. "No!" Ceres cried out, her voice hoarse as she staggered to her feet. She reached for the artifact again, trying to concentrate, to bring the energy under her control. She had no idea what she was doing, but it didn't matter. She had to act. Her hands shook as the energy continued to pulse, and she felt herself pulling from the depths of her mind, searching for something, anything, to break the power of the Guardian. "Release him," Ceres shouted, focusing on the artifact, willing it to do something. "Anything." The artifact responded. The crystal flared again, and the chamber trembled with an intensity that shook the very walls. The dark tendrils around Kale began to waver, their grip weakening. He broke free with a fierce cry, tumbling backward and landing hard on the stone floor. His body was covered in burns, but he was alive. But the Guardian wasn't finished. It extended its hand, and a dark wave of energy surged toward Ceres, the ground beneath her cracking as it approached. Ceres had only a moment to react. With a cry of desperation, Ceres summoned all the power she could, pushing the artifact's energy outward in a focused wave. The pulse of light collided with the dark energy head-on, and the force of their clash sent a shockwave rippling through the chamber. The walls cracked and split further, the ceiling beginning to crumble under the strain. Ceres staggered, her body on the verge of collapse from the exertion. But she held on. She had to. She couldn't let the Guardian win. This was their only chance. The Guardian staggered back, its form flickering again. The light from the artifact flared brighter, consuming the room, and for a split second, Ceres felt an overwhelming sense of power, raw, untamed, and endless. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light faded, and the room fell silent. The Guardian was gone. Ceres collapsed to her knees, her vision spinning. The artifact pulsed softly in her hands, now glowing with a steady, calming light. Kale was beside her in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "You did it," Kale said softly, his voice filled with awe. Ceres barely heard him, her mind reeling. What had just happened? The Guardian, the artifact, the power, it was all too much. But beneath the exhaustion and confusion, there was a sense of triumph. They had done it.
They had survived.
She took a shaky breath and turned to Kale. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Kale looked at the artifact in her hands, his expression filled with a mix of wonder and caution. Now we figure out how to use it. And we hope we can control it before it controls us. Saris nodded, but the weight of their next steps hung heavy in the air. They had just uncovered the most powerful object in the galaxy, an object capable of altering the course of history, and possibly of saving or destroying everything they knew. But there was no turning back now. As they made their way back up the staircase, Saris clutched the artifact tightly. The faint hum of its energy echoed in her ears as they exited the chamber, but her thoughts were on what lay ahead. Rhyros was dying. The galaxy was on the brink of chaos. And now they had something that could either lead to its salvation or its doom. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Outside, the once scorched sky had darkened further, the dying sun casting long shadows across the wasteland. The landscape stretched out before them, a desolate expanse of broken land and the remnants of an ancient world. But now, Sarah saw it differently. The ruins weren't just a tomb. They were a doorway. And the artifact in her hands was the key. "We have to take this back," Sarah said, her voice steady. "To Tyler. To the Council. They'll need to understand what this is. They'll need to prepare for what's coming." Kale looked out across the horizon, his eyes narrowing. "We can't trust anyone with this kind of power. Not without knowing more. The artifact might be our only hope, or it could be the end of everything." Saris met his gaze. "We don't have a choice.
We can't stop now."
Not when the fate of Rhyros and the galaxy is at stake. Kale didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. "Then we move forward. Together." With that, they set their course back toward the city and beyond, toward a future fraught with danger, mystery, and the hope that the power in Saris's hands could be wielded for good. The galaxy, still unaware of the forces that had just been unleashed, remained on the edge of its greatest crisis. And they would be there, in the heart of it, ready to face whatever came next. The journey back to the heart of Rhyros was long and perilous. Saris and Kale moved quickly through the ruins, knowing that every hour brought them closer to the truth about the artifact and the forces that might seek to control it. They kept to the shadows, avoiding detection, knowing that there were others out there who would stop at nothing to seize the power they had uncovered. But they had no choice. They couldn't leave the artifact unprotected. As they traveled, Saris's mind was consumed by the questions that had yet to be answered. What was the artifact truly capable of? What had driven the ancient civilization to create something so powerful and so dangerous? And most pressing of all, could she control it? Could anyone? The artifact still pulsed gently in her hands, its glow soft but steady, like the heartbeat of a slumbering giant. It seemed to whisper to her, its energy tugging at the edges of her mind. The visions she had experienced in the chamber beneath the ruins had been overwhelming. Flashes of distant stars, civilizations rising and falling, battles fought in the darkness of space. But there had been something else, something dark and unsettling. A warning, perhaps. Or a premonition. Whatever it was, Saris couldn't shake the feeling that the artifact was both a gift and a curse. "Kale," she said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "What do you think about all of this?" Kale was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as they walked. His face was drawn, hardened by the years spent surviving in the desert and the many battles he had fought. But beneath the toughness, Saris knew there was a sense of doubt, a weariness. He had always been pragmatic, focused on survival above all else. But now, with the artifact in their possession, the stakes were much higher. "I think we've unleashed something we don't fully understand," he said finally. "But I also think we don't have a choice. If we don't find a way to use it to save Rhyros, no one will. If we fail, the planet dies, and everything goes with it." Saris nodded.
"I know."
"But what if we can't control it? What if we're too late?" Kale glanced at her, his expression grim. Then we'll die trying. Saris didn't respond. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. There was no going back. They had committed to this mission, and there was no turning back now. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, the once proud capital of Rhyros now a shadow of its former self, the first hints of danger were already emerging. The air felt thick with tension, the streets eerily quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Saris knew that something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. As they entered the city, the distant hum of machinery echoed from the buildings around them. The remnants of the once great metropolis loomed in the distance, high towers of stone and metal now decaying under the harsh winds of the wasteland. The smell of burned metal and ash lingered in the air, a reminder of the planet's slow decline. "Stay alert," Kale whispered, his eyes scanning every corner. "We're not the only ones who know about the artifact. If the Council has already heard about it, things could get ugly." Saris tightened her grip on the artifact, her pulse quickening. She had no idea who they could trust. The Council of Rhyros had once been a beacon of hope, but over the years, its leaders had become more focused on power than the welfare of the people. And now, with the discovery of the artifact, they might be willing to do anything to control it. They moved through the streets quickly, staying close to the shadows. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the city, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Saris could sense the growing unrest in the air, the whispers of rebellion, of factions forming in secret, all jockeying for power as Ryros's sun grew weaker. They finally reached the outer gates of the Council's stronghold, a massive complex of sleek metallic buildings that towered above the city's ruins. The gates were heavily guarded, the guards in dark uniforms standing motionless, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. But Saris and Kale had already made preparations. Kale led them to a side entrance, at the narrow alleyway that led beneath the complex. As they approached, Saris could hear the faint sound of voices from inside. The council was in session. She could only imagine the heated debates taking place, the growing divide over what to do with the artifact. "This is it," Kale said, his voice low. "Once we get inside, there's no turning back." Saris nodded. She knew what she had to do. She had to get the artifact into the hands of the right people, those who would understand its potential and its dangers. But even as she walked toward the entrance, a cold feeling settled in her stomach. What if the council wasn't the answer? What if they were as corrupt as she feared? They passed through the side door, slipping inside the complex undetected. The interior was cold, sterile, and silent, its metal floors echoing with every footstep. They moved through the halls, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting of the inner sanctum. Finally, they reached a large chamber, a circular room with high, vaulted ceilings, its walls lined with glass panels that overlooked the city. Inside, the council sat at a massive table, their faces obscured in shadow. But Saris recognized them all, the aging leaders of Rhyros, men and women who had once been respected for their wisdom and vision. Now, though, they seemed disconnected from the struggles of the people, their faces drawn in grim determination, their eyes cold. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Council," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves that gripped her. "I have something that could save this planet and the galaxy. But I need your help." The council members turned toward her, their eyes narrowing as they studied her and Kale. "You've returned," one of them said, a voice heavy with suspicion. "And you've brought something with you?" Saris lifted the artifact, holding it out before them. "This is the key to our survival. But it's also a weapon, and it must be treated with respect. We don't fully understand its power, but we know that it can either save us or destroy us." There was a long silence as the council exchanged wary glances. Finally, the same voice spoke again. "Hand it over, Saris. We'll ensure it's used wisely." Saris's stomach churned. She had come this far, but she had no intention of giving the artifact away so easily. She didn't trust them, not after everything she had seen, everything she had learned. We can't trust anyone with this, Sarah said, her voice firm. We don't know what it will do. But I do know that we can't let anyone with their own agendas control it. The room fell silent again, the tension rising like a storm. And then, from the shadows, a new voice spoke, one that Saris recognized all too well. You're right. We can't trust anyone. The figure stepped forward, its cloak billowing around it like a storm. It was the Guardian. Not even you, it said with a cold smile. The Guardian's presence in the council chamber was a shock, but it was also a revelation. Saris's heart raced as she took a step back, instinctively moving closer to Kale, who immediately reached for his weapon. The cold, ominous figure of the Guardian towered in the doorway, its dark cloak swirling around it, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the chamber. How did you get in here? Saris demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The Guardian had disappeared in the ruins beneath Rairos, leaving nothing but the lingering remnants of its wrath. But now, here it was again, and the air was thick with the promise of conflict. The Guardian's laugh was low and cruel, echoing off the cold metal walls of the chamber. You think the artifact is the only thing that's been watching, Saris? It stepped forward, its eyes locking onto hers. I have been here longer than you can imagine, and I will not let you or anyone else wield that power. The council members, once silent observers, were now frozen in shock, too afraid to speak. The figure before them wasn't just some myth. It was a living, breathing relic of the past, and it held knowledge and power that dwarfed anything the council could muster. We should have never believed you were truly gone, one of the council members muttered under his breath. What is it you want? What will it take for you to leave us in peace? The Guardian's form shimmered, and for a moment, it seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if its very being could not be contained by the limits of the room. Peace, it hissed, a cruel smile spreading across its face. I do not seek peace, fool. I seek justice. Saris felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't understand what the Guardian was trying to say, but she knew one thing for certain. This being, this ancient force, was far more dangerous than any enemy she had ever faced. And now it seemed intent on stopping them from using the artifact. What do you want with the artifact? Kale demanded, his voice low but forceful. He had his blaster drawn, but the Guardian's mere presence made him hesitate. Even with all his experience in combat, he knew that facing the Guardian was like facing the very universe itself. He had no idea how they could win. The Guardian turned to Kale, its expression unreadable, then back to Saris. You do not understand, do you? It said, its voice soft, almost pitying. The artifact is not a gift, it is a curse. You think you can control it, but it controls you. That is the nature of its power. Saris gripped the artifact tightly, her knuckles white. She could feel its energy coursing through her again, but now it was different. It pulsed with a dark, almost malicious undertone, as though it were feeding on the fear and uncertainty in the room. The artifact is a relic of my civilization, the Guardian continued, its eyes narrowing. We sought to wield power beyond our understanding, and in the end, it destroyed us. We thought we could control the stars, but the stars themselves have a will of their own. And the artifact, it was the key to that power. The council members began to stir, whispers of fear spreading among them. Some took a step back, others looked toward the exit, but all were clearly on edge. The Guardian's presence was oppressive, suffocating, and they knew they had no power here. They had been holding on to a fragile hope for too long, but now the truth was clear. The ancient power they had unearthed might be their undoing. Saris stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. If the artifact is a curse, then why didn't you stop us when we first found it? Why did you let us bring it here? The Guardian's gaze softened, almost regretful, but the menace never left its eyes. I tried. I failed. But you, Saris, you're different. You are the one who will carry this power forward, for better or for worse. The room fell silent as Saris absorbed its words. The weight of her destiny was now clear. She had come so far, and now it was her choice, her responsibility, to decide how the galaxy would change. She could feel the artifact's pull growing stronger, its energy calling to her, promising answers and more power than she could comprehend. But at what cost? Kale's voice broke the silence, quiet but fierce. We don't need to control it. We just need to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. The Guardian's laugh was cold, almost hollow. You think you can stop what's coming? You think you can control this power without becoming part of it? The artifact does not bow to your will, Saris. It will break you, just as it broke us. Saris turned to Kale, her expression determined. We won't let that happen. We won't let it consume us. With that, she raised the artifact higher, feeling the energy crackle through her veins, the immense power threatening to tear her apart. She knew she had only one option left. We won't control it, she said, her voice gaining strength. But we can use it to stop you. The Guardian's eyes flickered with sudden recognition, and for a moment, Saris saw a flash of something, a memory, perhaps, cross its face. But then it was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. You are a fool, Saris, the Guardian spat. You cannot defeat me. I am the last of my kind. I am the legacy of a dying empire. Not anymore, Saris replied, her eyes narrowing. The galaxy doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the future. With a final surge of strength, she pushed the artifact forward, unleashing the energy within it in a brilliant wave of light. The chamber shook violently, the walls cracking, the ceiling threatening to collapse as the raw power flooded the room. The Guardian screamed, its form writhing in agony as the light consumed it. Kale shielded his eyes from the blinding radiance, the force of the blast almost knocking him to the ground. When the light finally faded, the chamber was eerily still. The Guardian was gone, its presence wiped from existence. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Sarah stood, breathing heavily, her body trembling from the exertion. The artifact in her hands had gone quiet, its glow softening to a gentle pulse. We did it, Kale said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Saris looked down at the artifact. The power was still there, dormant for now, but she knew that it wasn't over. They had only scratched the surface of its potential, and the galaxy would never be the same. But one thing was certain, the future was theirs to shape. With a final glance at the broken council chamber, Saris and Kale turned toward the doorway. The galaxy awaited, and whatever came next, they would face it together.